This plant is a small example of what today we call grass tree. Latin name is Xanthorrhoea, and Noongar around Albany it's called Palak. Up around Perth, a very closely related species is called Balga, for which the suburb in Perth, Balga, is named. And it's named because this is one of the most useful plants in the Australian bush. The genus occurs right across Australia, from Sydney right up into North Queensland. There's even a Central Australian species, Xanthorrhoea thorntoni, and it has many uses. This one is in flower at the moment, and you might notice that there are flowers formed here towards the sun right at the top, so it's getting towards the end of the flowering, but none on the south side here. So one very simple use of this is when it's flowering is a compass plant. So it always flowers where the warmth first hits the stalk, and produces flowers eventually around the back. So you can tell north-south from it straight away. Produces lots of nectar, and Noongars for snacks would just go like this, and then you get nice nectar, sweet repast as you're walking through the bush. Lots of insects and birds feed on that nectar, parrots and honey eaters and the like. The needles themselves were broken off and strewn around mire, around their huts, and sometimes used as a mattress. But some Noongars on the west coast tell me it was also as a protection against snakes, who find it difficult to get a grip on a bed of these slippery needles. But also this provided the covering over the mire. So these are little half-dome shaped huts, and the actual scape of the flower was used sometimes as a support. So you'd form your infrastructure like that, and you would use this sort of thatching for a dry camp, a place where rain was less likely but a good windbreak, that sort of thing. If you wanted thoroughly dry and partly fireproof mire, you used paper bark, melaleuca, which is incredibly useful as well. Another use of this plant is for starting fires. So if you don't have matches, of course, and there aren't flints here in this landscape, it's a granite landscape, so there are different sized flowering scapes, and I've got an example here of an older one, and you can see it's quite thick. It's almost an inch or so, 2 or 3 mils in diameter, and what they do is use their stone axes to split that in half and open it up. And here's an example I'll just get for you of one where nature has done that for us. This wouldn't be used, to be a fresher one, but that's the base for getting a thinner stem like the one on the flowering plant here, and basically this becomes the base. You put that on the ground and you carve a little notch in it there, and you sprinkle tiny bits of sand and put your tinder underneath it, and then you get a thinner round stem like this one here. And if you can imagine that's on the ground, then the technique is to twirl this thinner one into the notch where the sand is, and the sand warms up very rapidly to the point of being almost red hot, and spills into the tinder. And I've seen Noongar people light a fire in 2 minutes, under dry conditions admittedly, but that's how you get a fire going in typical Noongar country where grass trees, where palak or balga are found. And the other great asset that this plant offers is just across the trail here, so let me take you over to a bigger one. And this one has a trunk. When it gets burnt, these are the leaf bases, that little pattern there, so these leaves burn down to produce a base like that, and out of those leaf bases oozes a resin. So see this red stuff? It often forms nice little bubbles, and that, if you grind it up and mix it with kangaroo dung and a bit of charcoal, you end up with what's called a thermoplastic, and heat it up. You've got to heat it up. So you grind it up and make a powder, grind a bit of kangaroo dung like fiberglass to give a bit of fibre, and charcoal so that the heating and cooling can be controlled. And then you get your haft or your stick of to be used for, say, a tarp, a knife, or a mira, a spear thrower, or woomera, wherever you want to stick stone onto a wooden haft. And you dip it in the powder and then roll it gently over a fire. And it turns into black stuff like black plastic. And so you build it up by adding more powder on the outside of the melted black plastic until it forms a knob or a sausage. And on a tarp, a knife, you can make a serrated edge tarp by inserting up to 10 bits of chert or quartz or shell even with sharp edges along a 10 centimetre or so length. And the beauty of this super plastic or thermoplastic is as it cools it goes like plasticine, and so you've got to judge the temperature right, otherwise it's a very painful experience. Imagine trying to handle burnt rubber, for example, but at the right temperature, while it's still warm, you can mould it like plasticine, and then as it cools to room temperature, rock hard like fiberglass. If one of your bits of stone teeth falls out, easy, you just reheat the whole thing and put a new one in. So it's a recyclable, adhesive thermoplastic that's used for tool making wherever this genus occurs in Australia. It was recorded by the earliest of explorers, in fact a Dutch expedition in the 1650s near Bunbury, south of Perth, noticed that the axe or hammer had a resin-like substance and took it back to the Netherlands, but it's never been recovered. But that was the earliest account of this technology. And Aboriginal cultures use alternatives. They use spinifex resin in Central Australia for the same purpose. Even poverty bushes, Eremophila, which have resin on their leaves. They're much harder work than this. This is a ready source, and people from the Western Desert would often come into Noongar country to trade and try and get some of this beautiful resin off the grass trees. So as you can see, all sorts of uses. The final use, which is fatal, or two final uses which is fatal to the tree, is it's got a single growing apex right in the middle of all the leaves there, and they're white, and they were special medicine. If a man was almost mortally speared or had serious wounds, they would go on a diet of those leaf bases, and the medicinal properties would help recovery, if recovery was possible. And lastly, there's two groups of beetle larvae that will colonise the trunks of these things when they die. One is a big chunky species about the size of my finger, about that size, and is curly and it's white. And another is thinner and straight, so you get about 2 or 3 the width of my finger. The big ones live up on top of the trunk, the little ones live down the bottom. So individuals would own clumps of these grass trees, and it would be a spearing offence if you just wanted in and harvested the bardies, as they're called, or bard, the beetle larvae, without permission. That was serious. In fact, one of the colonial superintendents at Albany was visited by a man who walked in 30 miles to complain about another man who'd done just that, and asking what the superintendent was going to do in terms of punishing this guy. So very obvious evidence that it was really important. And lastly, I've mentioned language before. Balga, or Baal, means he, she, me or it, so it's about persons, and this is Balga or Palak, so this is equated to being a living person. I am that person is me, so this would be regarded as my embodiment in the plant world. So even the name is telling you. Another word for Baal, use of Baal means stop or leave it alone, and so it's so important that it's the grass tree that's labelled "Leave me alone" because you haven't got permission to harvest. So really important tree for all of those reasons in Aboriginal culture. Beautiful in structural landscaping today, but many Australians may not know the real story of this wonderful resource that sits out in the bush.